Let's begin in the quiet. Before the coin, before the bill, before the digital chirp of a transaction clearing on a screen. Imagine a world without money. It is difficult to do. It requires stripping away almost every interaction you have with the modern world. No prices on the shelf. No wages deposited on Friday. No saving for a rainy day. Because there is nothing to save but the food in your cellar and the wood in your stack. We often imagine this ancient world in a very specific way. We have a story we tell ourselves, a story that appears in economics textbooks and cartoons. The story of Barter. It goes like this. You are a shoemaker. You have made a pair of boots, sturdy leather, stitched with care. But you are hungry. You do not need boots. You need wheat. So you walk to the baker. You place your boots on the counter and ask for a sack of flour. But the baker looks at your boots and shakes his head. He doesn't need boots. He already has boots. He needs a new wheel for his cart. You are stuck. You have value, the boots, but you cannot unlock it. This is what Adam Smith, the father of modern economics, called the double coincidence of wants. For trade to happen in this imaginary version of the past, two strangers have to meet at the exact same time, wanting exactly what the other person has. It is a clumsy dance, a friction. And so, the story goes, man invented money to grease the gears, to make the shoemaker's life easier. It is a tidy story, logical, clean. It is also, largely, a myth. When anthropologists look at the way humans actually lived for tens of thousands of years, they don't find shoemakers frantically searching for wheelwrights. They don't find villages paralyzed by the inability to swap chickens for shoes. What they find is something much more human, something softer, and something much more complicated. They find the gift. Let's walk through a village in a time before history. The air smells of wood smoke and damp earth. The sounds are intimate. The lowing of cattle, the rhythmic thud of an axe, the voices of neighbors calling across the lane. Here, everyone knows everyone. You know who is lazy. You know who is generous. You know whose harvest failed last autumn and whose nets were full of fish this morning. In this world, if you need wheat, you do not trade your boots for it. You simply ask. You go to your neighbor, the one with the surplus grain. You say, "My family is hungry," and he gives it to you. He does not ask for payment. He does not ask for a coin. He hands you the sack. But, and this is the crucial part, it is not free. Nothing is ever truly free. When he hands you that wheat, a silent, invisible thread is spun between you. A weight is placed on the scale of your relationship. You now owe him. Not a specific number of coins, not a contract written on paper. You owe him a favor. You owe him social standing. You owe him the knowledge that when his roof leaks in the spring, rains, you will be the one to climb up and fix it. This is the economy of the credit ledger, but the ledger is not written in a book. It is written in the mind. It is a system of I owe yous, maintained by memory and social pressure. It sounds beautiful, doesn't it? A community helping one another, a tapestry of mutual aid. But let's look closer. Let's feel the texture of this system. It isn't just warm and fuzzy. It is heavy. It is suffocating. In a gift economy, you are never free of your neighbors. Every bite of food you eat, every tool you use, might be tethered to an obligation. You are bound to these people. If you anger the community, if you fail to repay the social debt, you don't just go bankrupt. You are cast out. You starve. The gift is a weapon of social cohesion. It keeps everyone in line. And this system only works when you know the people you are dealing with. It works in the tribe. It works in the village. But what happens when a stranger walks out of the forest? Let's imagine that moment. The stranger is wearing clothes you don't recognize. He speaks a dialect that sounds thick and strange to your ears. He is carrying something you want. Maybe it is obsidian, that black volcanic glass that cuts sharper than any flint. You want it. You need it for your arrowheads. But you cannot use the gift economy with him. You cannot say, "Give me the obsidian, and I will fix your roof next spring." He will be gone next spring. He doesn't care about your reputation. He doesn't care about your social standing. The invisible threads of obligation do not reach him. There is no trust. This is where barter actually happens. Barter isn't what neighbors do. Barter is what enemies do, or at least what strangers do. It is tense. It is suspicious. Picture the scene. You stand on the edge of the clearing. You hold out a stack of furs. He holds out the obsidian. You step forward, eyes locked on his hands, looking for a sudden movement, a trick. You place the furs on a rock. He places the stone. You inspect it. Is it cracked? Is it flawed? He fingers the fur. Is it mangy? Is it thin? You argue. You gesture. You might even threaten. This is not a transaction of efficiency. It is a ritual of potential violence. You are trying to get the best of him before he gets the best of you. And once the swap is done, you grab your goods and you back away. The deal is closed. The relationship is over. You owe him nothing. He owes you nothing. That is the freedom of the spot trade. But it is rare. It is exhausting. You cannot build a civilization on staring down strangers in the woods. So, humanity found itself in a dilemma. We had the village, where trust was high, but goods were limited. And we had the horizon, where goods were plentiful, spices, metals, fabrics. But trust was non-existent. We needed a bridge. We needed a way to take the trust that existed between neighbors and make it portable. We needed a way to freeze value, to hold it in our hands so we could carry it across the line where friendship ended and commerce began. We needed a third thing, not my boots, not your wheat, but a third thing that we both agreed to want. This search for the third thing is the story of money. But before we get to gold, before we get to silver, we have to look at what humanity tried first. Because we didn't start with metal. We started with what the earth gave us. We started with the things we could eat, the things we could use, and the things that were simply, undeniably beautiful. In the early days, money was alive. In ancient Mesopotamia, before the great cities rose, the unit of account wasn't a coin. It was barley. Sila, that was the word. A sila of barley, roughly a liter. Imagine the warehouse of the temple. The air is thick with dust and the sweet, dry smell of grain. This was the bank. The priests were the bankers. You worked for the temple and they paid you in barley. You could eat it. You could brew it into beer. It was useful. It had intrinsic value. If the economy collapsed, if no one wanted to trade, you could still survive on your wages. But think about the logistical nightmare of this. If you wanted to buy a new house, you couldn't carry a wallet. You had to drag a cart, or 10 carts. Barley rots. Rats eat it. It gets wet and sprouts. It is heavy. It varies in quality. Some grains are plump, some are shriveled. How do you pay a soldier who is marching 1,000 miles away? Do you send a wagon train of grain with him? We needed something more durable. We looked to the animals. In many Indo-European languages, the words for money and cattle are deeply intertwined. The Latin word pecunia, meaning money, comes from pecus, meaning cattle. The rupee in India comes from the Sanskrit word for silver, but before that, wealth was measured in cows. A cow is a mobile bank account. It walks itself to market. It reproduces, paying you interest in the form of calves. It gives milk. But again, the problem of divisibility. You want to buy a loaf of bread, you have a cow. You cannot cut off the cow's ear to pay for the bread. You have to sell the whole cow. And cows die. They get sick. They wander off. Humanity was experimenting. We were trying to find a container for value that didn't rot, didn't die, and didn't need to be fed. We tried salt. In Rome, the legions were sometimes paid in salt or given an allowance to buy it, their salarium. It is where we get the word salary. Salt was perfect in many ways. It preserved life. It kept food from spoiling. In a world without refrigerators, salt was the difference between survival and starvation. It was white gold. It could be divided into bricks, into grains. It lasted forever if you kept it dry, but it was heavy, and if it rained, your fortune dissolved into the mud. We tried cacao beans in Central America. The Maya and the Aztecs used them as small change. A rabbit might cost 10 beans. A slave might cost 100. Imagine the temptation. You are walking to the market with your money in your pocket, and your money smells delicious. The discipline required not to eat your own wealth. These were all commodity monies. They were things that had value because you could use them. But for money to truly take flight, it had to make a leap. It had to separate itself from usefulness. It had to become valuable, not because you could eat it, or burn it, or plant it. It had to be valuable simply because everyone else agreed it was valuable. This is a profound psychological shift. It is the moment we invented symbolic value. And to find one of the most beautiful and strange examples of this, we have to travel to the Pacific Ocean, to a tiny scattering of islands called Yap. Close your eyes and feel the tropical breeze, the sound of waves breaking on the coral reef. The people of Yap had a problem. They had plenty of food, they had fish, but they had no metal, they had no gold. But they needed a way to mark status. They needed a way to pay for big things, dowries, alliances, political favors. So they chose stone, but not just any stone. They chose limestone, specifically a glittering, crystalline limestone that was not found on their island. To get this stone, the men of Yap had to paddle their canoes 400 kilometers across the open ocean to the island of Palau. It was a dangerous journey. Storms could capsize them. Sharks trailed their boats. When they arrived in Palau, they would carve the limestone into massive discs. Some were small, the size of a dinner plate. Others were giants, 12 feet across, weighing nearly as much as an elephant. They carved a hole in the center so they could slide a pole through and carry them. These were the Rai stones. The value of the stone wasn't in the stone itself. You couldn't eat limestone. You couldn't make a spear out of it. The value was in the story. The value was the struggle. When a team of men brought a stone back to Yap, everyone knew how hard it had been. They knew who had carved it. They knew if anyone had died on the journey. The harder the journey, the more valuable the stone. The suffering was the currency. But here is the most fascinating part, the part that teaches us what money really is. Some of these stones were too heavy to move. Once they were set down in a village, they stayed there. Moss grew on them. Weeds sprouted around the base. When you spent the stone, say, to give it to a neighboring chief for a wedding, you didn't move it. You couldn't. You simply stood in front of the village and announced, "This stone now belongs to him." And everyone agreed. The ownership changed, but the object remained. There is a famous story, recorded by a Western traveler in the 19th century, about a particular rye stone. Years ago, a crew was towing a massive stone behind their canoe on the way back from Palau. A great storm rose up. The waves were mountainous. The canoe was being dragged down by the weight of the stone. To save their lives, the crew cut the rope. The stone plummeted into the dark water. It sank to the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. It was gone. No one could see it. No one could touch it. But when the crew returned to Yap, they told the story. They testified that the stone was huge, of magnificent quality, and that it was lost through no fault of their own. And the elders of the village decided, the stone still counts. It was lying miles deep in the muck and the darkness, surrounded by silence and pressure. But in the minds of the people of Yap, it was still there. It still had value. It was traded for generations. People bought houses with a stone that no one had seen for 50 years. This sounds crazy to us, paying with an invisible stone at the bottom of the sea. But ask yourself, is it really so different from what we do today? When you buy a coffee with your credit card, do you see the money? Do you touch gold? No. A digital signal flies through a cable. A number changes on a server in a data center in Virginia. A number changes on a server in a bank in London. The money is just a record. It is just a shared agreement that you have value and you are transferring it. The rye stone at the bottom of the ocean is the perfect metaphor for money. Money is a ghost. It is a shared dream. It exists only because we all agree to pretend that it exists. But dreams are fragile. If we wake up, they disappear. So, humanity needed to ground the dream in something harder. Something that felt real. Something that stimulated the senses and satisfied the craving for solidity. We needed something that shone. We needed the shell. Let's travel from the Pacific to the Indian Ocean, to the Maldives. Here, in the warm, shallow lagoons, lived a small sea snail, Monetaria moneta, the money cowrie. It is a beautiful little thing, smooth, glossy, pale yellow, or creamy white. It feels like porcelain in your hand. It is light, durable, and impossible to counterfeit. Only nature can make a cowrie shell. For centuries, these shells were the currency of the world. They were harvested in the Maldives. Women would place palm fronds in the water. The snails would cling to them, and then they would be pulled up and dried in the sun. These shells flowed out of the Maldives like a river. They flowed into India. They flowed into China. They flowed across the great caravan routes into Africa. In the markets of Bengal, you could buy rice with shells. In the kingdoms of West Africa, they were woven into strings. The cowrie was successful because it had the properties of good money. It was durable. A shell can last for thousands of years. It was portable. It was divisible. You could pay one shell or a string of 40. It was uniform. Every shell looked roughly the same. And it had aesthetic value. It was jewelry. But the cowrie also tells us a darker story about money. Because money is not neutral. Money is power. And when money flows, it can wash away entire civilizations. In the 16th century, European traders, the Portuguese, the Dutch, the English, realized the value of these shells. They saw that in West Africa, people would trade gold, ivory, and humans for these little sea snails. So the Europeans went to the Maldives. They bought cowries by the ton. They filled the holds of their ships with them. Ballast. They sailed to West Africa and flooded the market. They used the shells to purchase enslaved people. The price of a human being was calculated in shells. In the early days, perhaps a few thousand. But as the Europeans dumped more and more shells into the economy, the value of the cowrie dropped. Inflation. By the 18th century, the price of a slave had risen to 160,000 shells. Imagine the physical reality of that. The sheer volume, sacks and sacks of clinking shells poured out to buy a life. The cowrie shows us that money can be weaponized. If you control the supply, you control the trade. The Europeans couldn't make the shells, but they could move them. They used the distance between the Maldives and Africa to arbitrage value, extracting human labor for the cost of transport. But shells, like barley and salt, had a limit. They were ultimately just objects found in nature. Their supply was determined by the biology of a snail. As empires grew, as armies needed to be paid, kings wanted more control. They didn't want to rely on what washed up on a beach. They wanted to create value themselves. They wanted to stamp their face on the world. They needed metal. The transition to metal was gradual. At first, it was just lumps. Hack silver. In the marketplaces of the ancient Near East, you would carry a bag of silver scraps, broken jewelry, ingots, twisted wires. When you wanted to buy something, you didn't count, you weighed. Every merchant carried a scale. You would put your silver on one side, and the merchant would put a weight on the other. A stone weight, perhaps carved in the shape of a duck or a lion. Shekel was not originally a coin. It was a weight, roughly 11 grams. Imagine the slowness of this. Every transaction required a scale. Every transaction required trust that the merchant's weights weren't rigged. Is that stone really a shekel, you might ask? It looks a little light. Is that silver really pure, the merchant might ask, or did you mix lead into it? Commerce was bogged down by the need to verify the money itself. We were spending half our time just checking the quality of the payment. We needed a guarantee. We needed a mark of authority. We needed the kingdom of Lydia. It is around 600 BC. We are in what is now Western Turkey. Lydia is a rich kingdom. The Pactolus River flows through it, and the sands of this river are glittering with electrum, a natural alloy of gold and silver. The Lydian kings, Aliates and his famous son, Croesus, had a brilliant idea. Instead of making people weigh the metal every time, why not weigh it in advance? Why not take a lump of electrum, make sure it is exactly the right weight, and then smash a symbol into it? A seal. A brand. The symbol would say, "I, the king, certify that this lump of metal is good." They chose the lion, the Lydian lion. It is a small, bean-shaped lump of metal. It doesn't look like a modern coin. It is thick and irregular, but stamped into one side is the roaring head of a lion, with a sunburst above it. This was the first true coin, and it changed everything. Suddenly, you didn't need a scale. You didn't need to be a metallurgist. You just needed to count. 1 lion, 2 lions, 3 lions. The friction of trade disappeared. Speed entered the market. You could pay a mercenary army in coins. You could collect taxes in coins. The coin was standardized, uniform, and sanctioned by the state. It also changed the way we thought about value. Before the coin, value was about weight. It was about substance. With the coin, value became about the face. If the king said it was worth a stater, it was worth a stater. Even if the king secretly mixed a little more copper into the mix, as long as the people accepted the stamp, the system worked. The coin severed the link between the raw material and the value. It was the first step toward the abstract money we have today. But metal is heavy. Carry 1,000 gold coins and your back will break. Carry 10,000 and you need a wagon. Travel a dangerous road with a bag of gold and you are a target. Every bandit in the hills can hear the jingle of your purse. As trade expanded, as the Silk Road stretched its dusty ribbons across the continents, merchants needed something lighter, something that could fly. For that, we have to look east. While Europe was fighting in the mud of the Dark Ages, counting its heavy silver pennies, China was about to invent the future. The river Pactolus runs through what is now Turkey. It is not a particularly large river. It winds through the valleys, over stones and through reeds, murmuring the way rivers do. But in the ancient world, this river was legendary. The story went that King Midas, the man with the golden touch, had washed his hands in these waters to cure himself of his curse. The magic washed off his skin and settled into the sand. And so, the legend said, the river glittered. It wasn't magic, of course. It was geology. The river carried alluvial electrum, a natural mixture of gold and silver, down from the Tmolus Mountains. It was here, on the muddy banks of this river, that the history of the world shifted on its axis. We are back in Lydia, in the 7th century BC. We talked briefly about the Lydian lion, that bean-shaped lump of stamped metal. But we need to stay here for a moment. We need to understand the magnitude of what happened when that first hammer struck that first anvil. Before this moment, wealth was private. If you had gold, you kept it in a chest. You wore it around your neck. It was a possession, like a sheep or a house. But when the Lydian kings began to mint coins, they turned wealth into something public. They turned it into a standard. Imagine the workshop where the first coins were made. It is hot. The air smells of charcoal and sweat. A furnace roars in the corner, melting the electrum dust gathered from the river. A worker takes a pair of tongs and pulls a glowing crucible from the fire. He pours the molten metal into little molds. They cool into small, irregular lumps, blanks. Then comes the moment of creation. Another worker places the blank on an anvil. The anvil has a design carved into it, the negative image of a lion. He holds a punch against the top of the blank. He raises a heavy hammer. Clang. The sound of money being born. The force of the blow drives the metal into the die. The gold squishes and flows, taking the shape of the carving. When it is lifted up, the blank is no longer just a piece of metal. It has a face. It has a voice. It says, "I am worth something because the king says so." This invention spread like wildfire. It was a technology of trust. Suddenly, you didn't need to know the person you were trading with. You didn't even need to speak their language. If they accepted the lion, you could do business. Lydia was a trading kingdom, a bridge between the East and the West. The coins flowed out of Sardis, the capital, and into the pockets of Greek merchants. And the Greeks fell in love with coins. If Lydia invented the coin, Athens perfected it. Let's travel across the Aegean Sea to the city of Athens. It is the 5th century BC, the Golden Age. Athens is a city of noise and light. Philosophers argue in the shade of the Stoa. Playwrights stage tragedies in the amphitheatre. But underpinning it all, fueling the art and the democracy and the navy, was a bird, the owl. The Athenian tetradrachm is perhaps the most famous coin in history. It is a thick, heavy chunk of silver. On one side, the helmeted head of Athena, the goddess of wisdom. On the other, her companion, the owl. The owl stands with big, staring eyes, an olive sprig beside it, and the letters A, T, H, E, the alpha, the theta, the epsilon, the mark of the city. These coins were not made of river dust. They were dug from the deep earth. About 30 miles south of Athens, at a place called Historyawn, rich veins of silver ran through the rock. The mining was brutal. Thousands of enslaved people worked in narrow, suffocating tunnels, chipping away at the rock by the light of flickering oil lamps. They lived and died in the dark so that Athens could shine. It is important to remember this. Money often hides the labor that creates it. The silver coin in your hand feels cool and smooth, but its origin is sweat and stone. In 483 BC, the Athenians struck a massive new vein of silver at Historyawn. Suddenly, the city was flush with wealth. There was a debate. What should they do with this windfall? Some politicians wanted to distribute the silver to the citizens, a payout, a universal dividend. Let everyone have a pocket full of owls. But a man named Themistocles stood up. He was a general, a strategist. He looked at the horizon and saw a storm gathering. The Persian Empire was coming. He argued that Athens should not spend the silver on luxuries. They should spend it on wood. They should build a fleet of triremes, fast, maneuverable warships. The assembly voted. They chose the ships. They used the silver to pay the shipwrights, the rowers, the sailors. They transformed the metal from the ground into a wooden wall on the sea. And when the Persians attacked at the Battle of Salamis, it was that fleet, bought with the silver of Historyawn, that saved Greece. This is one of the first great lessons of the coin. Money is stored energy. It is potential action. The silver in the ground was useless rock. But stamped into coins, it became a navy. It became freedom. The Athenian owl became the dollar of the ancient world. It was the reserve currency. You could take an owl to Egypt, to Sicily, to Persia, and people would accept it. They knew the weight was good. They knew Athens didn't cheat. The coin became a symbol of the city itself. To bring owls to Athens became a proverb, meaning to do something pointless, like bringing coals to Newcastle. But the rise of money did something else to Greek society. It changed the way people thought. Before money, life was governed by tradition, by obligation, by the vague and shifting values of the gift economy. But money is precise. It is mathematical. It puts a number on everything. A loaf of bread, 2 obols, a pair of sandals, 4 drachmas, a day of labor, 1 drachma. Once you start pricing things, you start asking dangerous questions. If a pair of sandals has a price, does a vote have a price? Does justice have a price? Does a human being have a price? The philosophers worried about this. Aristotle, writing in the 4th century BC, was suspicious of money. He saw that it allowed people to accumulate wealth for its own sake. In the old days, there was a limit to how rich you could be. You could only own so much land, so many cattle. But with money, there is no limit. You can stack coins to the moon. This created a new kind of greed, a hunger that could never be satisfied. There is a story about the cynic philosopher Diogenes. He lived in a barrel in the marketplace of Athens. He owned nothing. He rejected the whole system. One day, he was seen begging for money from a statue. A passerby laughed and asked, "Diogenes, why are you begging from a stone statue? It cannot give you anything." Diogenes replied, "I am practicing being rejected." He understood that in a world ruled by money, the man without it is invisible. He was trying to harden himself against the coldness of a monetized world. But the world did not listen to Diogenes. The world wanted the coins, and no one wanted them more or used them more effectively than the Romans. If the Greeks treated money as a tool for trade, the Romans treated it as a tool for empire. The Roman monetary system was a machine. At the center of it was the denarius, a small silver coin about the size of a dime. For hundreds of years, the denarius was the heartbeat of the Mediterranean economy. From the misty forests of Britain to the scorching sands of Syria, the denarius was king. The Romans understood something crucial about money. It is the ultimate propaganda. In a world without newspapers, without television, without the internet, how do you tell the people who is in charge? You put your face on their money. When you held a denarius, you were holding a portrait of the emperor. You saw his profile. You saw the laurel wreath on his head. You read his name, Caesar Augustus, Trajan, Marcus Aurelius. Every time you bought a cup of wine, you were reminded of who owned the world. Julius Caesar was the first living Roman to put his face on a coin. Before him, they only used the faces of gods or long-dead ancestors. To put your own living face on the money was seen as arrogant. It was something kings did, and Rome hated kings. When Caesar did it, it was a scandal. It was one of the reasons the senators sharpened their knives. But after Caesar, every emperor did it. They used coins to tell the news. Did the emperor win a great victory in Germany? Issue a coin with a picture of a bound captive and the word Victoria. Did the emperor build a new aqueduct? Issue a coin with a picture of the arches. Did the emperor have a new heir? Put the boy's face on the coin so the people learned to love him. The coins were little metallic newspapers circulating through the hands of millions. But the Roman system had a fatal flaw, a flaw that would eventually help bring the empire crashing down. The flaw was the temptation of the mint. Running an empire is expensive. You have to pay the legions. You have to pay the bureaucrats. You have to pay for the bread and circuses to keep the mob happy in Rome. For a long time, Rome paid for this by conquering new lands. They would march into Dacia or Carthage, loot the treasuries, and bring the gold and silver back to Rome. The plunder paid the bills. But eventually, the conquest stopped. The borders stabilized. The flow of free gold dried up. But the costs didn't stop. The soldiers still wanted their pay. So the emperors faced a choice. They could raise taxes, which was unpopular and difficult, or they could cheat. They chose to cheat. It started slowly. Under the Emperor Nero, the silver purity of the denarius was reduced slightly, from 100% silver to maybe 95%. No one noticed at first. The coin looked the same. It weighed the same. But the emperor had magically created free money. He could take the 5% of silver he saved and mint more coins. It seemed like the perfect solution, but once you start, it is hard to stop. Over the next 200 years, the silver content of the Roman currency collapsed. 90%, 80%, 50%. By the crisis of the 3rd century, the coin known as the Antoninianus, which was supposed to be a double denarius, was barely silver at all. It was a copper coin with a thin, silvery wash over the top. Soldiers would get their pay, and within weeks the silver coating would rub off, revealing the brown copper underneath. They called it silver washed. It was a lie you could hold in your hand, and the markets reacted. If the money is bad, you need more of it to buy the same things. Prices skyrocketed. In the 2nd century, a measure of wheat might cost 7 or 8 drachmas. By the 3rd century, it cost thousands. The emperors tried to fight it. They didn't understand inflation. They thought the merchants were just being greedy. In the year 301, the Emperor Diocletian issued a famous decree, the Edict on Maximum Prices. He sent scribes out to every market square in the empire to carve lists of prices into stone walls. A pound of pork shall cost no more than 12 denarii. A pair of shoes shall cost no more than 20. A bushel of barley shall cost no more than 5. The penalty for charging more was death. Imagine the scene. A soldier standing in the market, sword drawn, watching the butcher weigh the meat. The butcher is terrified. He knows that if he sells at the emperor's price, he will lose money. The coin is worthless. He can't buy the pig from the farmer for that price. So what did he do? He stopped selling. He closed his shop. He hid his goods. The markets emptied out. The economy froze. People stopped using coins. They went back to barter. They went back to the gift. The complex, continental trade network of Rome began to shatter into 1,000 tiny, isolated islands. The roads fell into disrepair. The pirates returned to the seas. The legions, unpaid or paid in worthless copper, abandoned their posts. The debasement of the currency was the debasement of the empire. When the trust in the money died, the civilization died with it. For the next several hundred years, in the West at least, money went to sleep. The feudal world rose up. This was a world of land, not coin. Lords owned the land. Peasants worked the land. They paid their rent in onions, in firewood, in days of labor. Coins still existed, but they were rare. They were for the rich. For the average person, the economy became local again. The horizon shrank back to the edge of the village. The silence returned. But while Europe slept in the mud, the story of money was not over. It was just moving. East, along the Silk Road, through the high mountain passes of the Hindu Kush, across the vast deserts of the Tarim Basin, the caravans were still moving, camels plodding through the sand, laden with bales of silk, jars of ginger, bundles of rhubarb. And in the saddlebags of these merchants, the heavy metal coins were becoming a burden. Imagine you are a merchant in the Tang dynasty of China. You want to buy a shipment of tea from the south. The cost is high. To pay for it in copper coins, the famous cash coins of China, round with a square hole in the middle, you would need a wagon train. The strings of cash were heavy. 1,000 coins weighed nearly 10 pounds. To buy a large shipment, you might need to move tons of copper. It was dangerous. It was slow. It was stupid. The merchants looked at these heavy strings of metal and thought, there must be a better way. They looked at paper. Paper had been invented in China centuries earlier. It was used for calligraphy, for poetry, for wrapping fish. But could it be used for value? It started in the city of Chengdu, in the Sichuan province. The merchants there formed a guild. They came up with a system. Instead of carrying the heavy iron and copper coins, you would leave your coins with a trustworthy merchant house. The house would count your coins, lock them in a vault, and give you a receipt. A piece of paper. On the paper, they would write the amount. They would stamp it with a secret seal using vermilion ink. They would perhaps draw a complex pattern of trees and houses, a design so intricate that no one could copy it. You could take this receipt, walk across the city, and use it to buy goods. The person who sold you the goods could then take the receipt back to the merchant house and claim the coins. Or, and this was the leap, they could just keep the receipt. They could use the receipt to buy something else from a third person. The receipt began to circulate. It detached itself from the vault. The people of Chengdu called it jiaozi. It means exchange, but it also sounds like the word for dumpling, a little wrapper of value. At first, this was a private system. It relied on the reputation of the merchant families. But the government of the Song dynasty watched this with interest. They saw the power of it. In the early 11th century, the Song government took over the system. They banned private receipts and issued the world's first official paper money. They called it huizi. It was a marvel. A sheet of mulberry paper, thick and fibrous, printed with woodblocks. It carried a warning printed right on the face: counterfeiters will be beheaded. And below that, the informant will receive a reward. It was a brilliant innovation. It unleashed the Chinese economy. Commerce moved at the speed of paper, not the speed of copper. But it shocked the visitors from the West. When Marco Polo traveled to China in the 13th century, he could not believe his eyes. He watched the Great Khan's officials take bark from mulberry trees, pound it into pulp, press it into sheets, and stamp it with red ink. And then, he watched people treat these scraps of bark as if they were gold. He wrote in his journals, with a tone of utter disbelief, "With these pieces of paper, they can buy anything and pay for anything, and I tell you that the papers that reckon as 10 bezants do not weigh one." To Marco Polo, coming from a world where value meant weight, where money meant metal, this was alchemy. The Great Khan had found a way to turn tree bark into wealth. Marco Polo called it the alchemy of the Khan. But alchemy is dangerous. The Chinese emperors discovered the same thing the Roman emperors had discovered, but on a much grander scale. With metal coins, you are limited by the amount of metal you can dig out of the ground. Even if you debase the coin, you still need some copper. But with paper, the supply is limited only by the amount of ink and mulberry bark you have, and the temptation to print is irresistible. When the Mongols took over China and established the Yuan dynasty, they embraced paper money with enthusiasm. But they didn't understand the discipline required to manage it. They fought wars. Wars are expensive, so they printed more notes. They built palaces. Palaces are expensive, so they printed more notes. The notes flooded the markets. The value of each note plummeted. People started to lose faith. They tried to get rid of their paper money as fast as possible, trading it for goods that had real value: grain, silk, metal. This is the phenomenon of hot money. The money burns a hole in your pocket. You have to spend it before it loses its worth. This creates a frenzy of buying, which drives prices up even faster. Hyperinflation. It was the first time in history a civilization had faced this specific monster: the death of the paper dream. By the time the Ming dynasty took power, the paper currency was so worthless that the government eventually gave up on it entirely. They went back to silver. For the next several hundred years, China, the inventor of paper money, would demand payment in hard, heavy silver. This decision would reshape the global economy. It would drive the Spanish to dig up the mountains of South America. It would create a river of silver flowing from the New World across the Pacific to the Old World, just to satisfy China's hunger for something solid. But the idea of paper could not be unthought. The genie was out of the bottle. It would take a few centuries and a different set of thinkers to tame it, to turn the wild, dangerous paper of the East into the disciplined, ledger-based banking of the West. For that, we must leave the mulberry forests of China and travel to the stone piazzas of Italy, to a city of art, intrigue, and careful accounting. Florence. The sun is setting over the Arno River, the bells of the Duomo are ringing, and sitting on a wooden bench, a banker. In the dusty street, a man is opening a large leather-bound book. He dips his quill in ink. He writes a name on the left side of the page. He writes a number. Then, on the right side of the page, he writes a corresponding number. The credits, the debits. He is not just writing numbers, he is inventing the modern world. This is the dawn of the Medici. This is the birth of the ledger. But let's pause here. Let the ink dry on the page. We have moved from the gift to the shekel, from the shell to the coin, from the copper string to the paper note. We have seen how money tries to solve the problem of trust, and how it constantly struggles against the problem of greed. In the next chapter, we will see how these Italian bankers took the concept of money and made it abstract, how they turned it into a system of pure mathematics that could span the globe, and how a physicist named Isaac Newton would accidentally lock the world into a cage of gold. The sun is setting over Florence. It is the year 1397. The light hits the terracotta tiles of the rooftops, turning the whole city into a landscape of burnt orange and deep shadow. Down in the narrow streets, the air is cooling, but it still smells of the day's work. The metallic tang of the dyer's vats, the sharp scent of tanned leather, and the heavy, sweet aroma of horse manure. In a small piazza, just off the main thoroughfare, a man is sitting on a wooden bench. He is not a king. He is not a general. He wears a simple robe, dark and unadorned. He is leaning over a table, a long trestle of rough-hewn oak. On the table is a cloth of green baize, stained with ink. And on the cloth lies a book. This man is a money changer, and the bench he sits on is called a banker. It is a simple word, banker. It just means bench or counter. But from this piece of furniture, we get the word that rules the modern world, bank. And if this man were to cheat his customers, if he were to lose the money entrusted to him, the town guards would come. They would not just arrest him, they would take an axe and smash his wooden bench into splinters. The bench would be broken. Bancarotta. Bankruptcy. This was the visceral reality of finance in the late Middle Ages. It was physical. It was wood and splinters. It was the fear of public shame. But the man sitting at the bench in 1397 is not going to break. He is building. His name is Giovanni di Bici de' Medici. He is the founder of a dynasty that will not only rule Florence, but will fund the Renaissance, pay for the art of Michelangelo and Botticelli, and produce 4 popes. But Giovanni is not interested in fame yet. He is interested in a problem. The problem is God, or more specifically, the church. In the medieval world, lending money at interest was a sin. It was called usury. The church fathers were clear on this. Money was barren. Metal could not breed metal. If you lent a man 10 gold florins and asked for 11 back, you were stealing time, and time belonged only to God. Dante Alighieri The great poet of Florence had placed usurers in the seventh circle of hell. Imagine the scene Dante painted, a desert of burning sand where a rain of fire falls eternally. The usurers sit crouched on the ground, frantically brushing the fire away from their skin, miserable and weeping, with heavy purses hanging from their necks. This was the terrifying image that haunted every merchant in Italy. You could be rich in this life, but you would pay for it with eternity in the fire. So, how do you run an economy? How do you lend money to a merchant who wants to sail a ship to Constantinople if you can't charge him for the risk? The economy was stuck. It was trapped between the need for credit and the fear of hell. Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici and his contemporaries found a loophole. A brilliant, complex, beautiful loophole. They invented the bill of exchange. It worked like a magic trick. It turned a loan into a transaction of distance. Here is how it worked. Let's say you are a merchant in Florence. You need money to buy wool. You go to the Medici bank. They do not lend you money. That would be a sin. Instead, they buy a bill from you. You give them a promise. You say, I will pay you back, not in Florence, but in London. And crucially, I will not pay you in gold florins. I will pay you in British pounds. The transaction was no longer a loan of time. It was an exchange of currency. Cambium non est mutuum. Exchange is not a loan. The trick was in the exchange rate. The Medici would set the exchange rate between the florin and the pound in a way that hid a profit. They gave you 100 florins in Florence, and you agreed to pay £25 in London. But if you did the math, those £25 were actually worth 110 florins. The 10 florins of profit were buried in the conversion. It wasn't interest. It was just the cost of doing business abroad. It was invisible, and because it was invisible, it was technically not a sin. This device, the bill of exchange, unlocked the world. Suddenly, money could travel. A merchant didn't need to carry a heavy chest of gold over the Alps, risking bandits and wolves. He just carried a piece of paper. The Medici Bank became a mechanism for teleporting value. Giovanni sat at his bench in Florence, but his mind was roaming the map. He had branches in Venice, in Rome, in Geneva, in London, in Bruges. He wasn't just moving money. He was moving information. The Medici couriers were some of the fastest riders in Europe. They rode through rain and snow, carrying the leather pouches that contained the bills. Because the bank knew what was happening in London before anyone else in Florence, they could bet on the markets. They knew if the wool harvest had failed. They knew if a king was preparing for war. Money was becoming information. But as the network grew, it became too complex for a single mind to hold. There were thousands of transactions. Loans to popes, payments to armies, deposits from widows, sales of alum and silk. How do you keep track of it all? How do you know if you are winning or losing? In the messy, chaotic world of the Middle Ages, most merchants just kept a diary. Today I bought a cow, tomorrow I hope to sell it. It was a narrative. It was sloppy. The Italians needed a system that was perfect, a system that could not lie. They found it in the work of a wandering mathematician named Luca Pacioli. Pacioli was a friend of Leonardo da Vinci. He was a brilliant, restless mind. In 1494, he published a massive book called the Summa de Arithmetica. It was a summary of everything known about mathematics, algebra, geometry, proportions. But tucked away in the middle of this book was a section called Particularis de Computis et Scripturis, details of calculation and recording. In these pages, Pacioli described a system that had been used in Venice for some time, but he was the first to codify it for the world. Double-entry bookkeeping. It sounds dry, it sounds like dust, but it is one of the most profound philosophical inventions in human history. Before double entry, money was just a pile of stuff. You had 10 coins, you spent 2, you had 8 left. Double entry changed the nature of reality. It stated that every transaction has 2 sides, a yin and a yang. For every debit, there must be a credit. If you buy a wagon for 10 florins, you don't just lose 10 florins, you gain a wagon. Your cash goes down, your assets go up. The equation must always balance. Assets dash liabilities plus equity. This created a closed universe, a mathematical mirror of the world. If the book didn't balance, if the numbers didn't match perfectly at the end of the day, then something was wrong. A mistake had been made, or a theft. The book became a moral instrument. It was a way of forcing the world to make sense. The Medici took this system and elevated it to an art form. They kept a libro segreto, a secret book. This wasn't for the clerks, this was for the partners. It tracked the real truth of the bank, the profits, the salaries, the capital. The libro segreto was kept locked in a chest. It was the heart of the empire. In its pages, money ceased to be physical. There were no coins in the book. There were only ink scratches. Giulio owes us 500. We owe the Pope 1,000. Money became a web of relationships. It became a measure of trust between people. And this abstract money, this ink money, was incredibly powerful. Because it was no longer tied to the physical amount of gold in the vault, the bankers could do something magical. They could lend out more than they had. This is the beginning of fractional reserve banking. If 10 people deposit gold with you, they rarely come back for it all at the same time. So you can lend that gold out to someone else. The gold is in the vault. But the receipt for the gold is circulating in the market. And the loan you gave to the borrower is also circulating. You have created money out of thin air. You have created money out of trust. This Medici money fueled the explosion of culture we call the Renaissance. When you look at the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel or the dome of the Florence Cathedral, you are looking at the product of the ledger. The painters needed to be paid. The architects needed stone. The laborers needed bread. The gold that paid for it all was often illusory. It was credit, spun out of the complex mathematics of the bank. But there was a danger in this abstraction. When money becomes math, it loses its tether to the ground. It can float away. If people stop believing in the book, the whole system collapses. We saw this happen to the Medici eventually. Bad loans to kings who wouldn't pay them back. The English monarchy defaulted on massive debts to the Florentine banks, destroying them. Bancarotta came for them in the end. But the idea survived. The bench and the book had conquered the world. By the 17th century, the center of gravity was shifting again, moving north, away from the warm piazzas of Italy to the cold, foggy streets of London and Amsterdam. The bankers there took the Italian invention and added a new layer: centralization. They realized that having 100 different private banks was chaotic. What if there was one bank, a bank for the nation? And what if that bank didn't just deal in gold, but in a new kind of standard? A standard that would try to lock the value of money down once and for all, to stop it from floating away. This brings us to a man who is famous for apples, for gravity, and for calculus. but who spent the last 30 years of his life chasing counterfeiters and measuring gold dust. Sir Isaac Newton. Most people don't know that the greatest physicist in history was also the accidental architect of the gold standard. We are about to leave the handwritten ledger and enter the age of the machine, the age of the mint, the age where we try to turn money into a science. The year is 1696. The place is London. London is not yet the gleaming capital of a global empire. It is a city of mud and smoke, recovering from fire and plague. The streets are narrow, crooked, and dark. And in the centre of the city, rising above the fog of the Thames, stands the Tower of London. It is a fortress, a prison, a palace. But tucked away between the inner and outer walls, in a row of rickety wooden buildings that tremble every time a cart goes by, is the beating heart of the English economy, the Royal Mint. It is a loud, dangerous place. Furnaces roar day and night. The air is thick with the acrid smell of melting metal and the sulphurous fumes of acid. Men with leather aprons and scarred hands work in the gloom, feeding strips of silver into heavy screw presses. Thump, thump, thump. Into this chaotic world walks a man who seems entirely out of place. He is 53 years old. He has wild grey hair and eyes that seem to look through you into the mathematical structure of the universe. He is the most famous philosopher in the world, the man who explained gravity, the man who unwove the rainbow. Sir Isaac Newton. He has just been appointed Warden of the Mint. Most people thought this was a retirement job, a sinecure, a nice salary for a famous old man who wanted to spend his days drinking tea and reading books. But Isaac Newton did not do retirement, and he did not do things by half measures. When he arrived at the Tower, he found the mint in a state of crisis, and he found the nation's money in a state of collapse. England was running out of silver. The problem was physical. The coins of the realm, the shillings and half-crowns, were old. They were hand-hammered discs of silver that had been circulating since the days of Queen Elizabeth. They were irregular, lumpy, and thin. And because they were irregular, they were easy to steal from. This was the age of clipping. A clipper was a thief who would take a pair of shears and snip a tiny sliver of silver off the edge of a coin. Then he would pass the coin on. The next person would snip a little more, and the next. Over decades, the coins had shrunk. A shilling was supposed to weigh 93 grains. By 1696, the average shilling weighed barely 50 grains. The money was literally dissolving. It was a national emergency. You would go to the market to buy a loaf of bread, and the baker would refuse your money. "That's not a shilling," he would say. "That's a washer." Trade was grinding to a halt. Riots were breaking out. The government decided on a radical solution. They would recall every single silver coin in the kingdom, melt them down, and recoin them, the Great Recoinage of 1696. It was a logistical nightmare. Imagine trying to replace all the cash in the United States or the Eurozone in a matter of months. Newton took charge. He approached the problem not like a bureaucrat, but like a physicist. He optimized the flow of the furnaces. He calculated the motion of the workers. He stayed up until 3 a.m., watching the presses, analyzing the efficiency of the strike. He turned the mint into a machine. Production soared. But Newton brought something else to the mint. He brought the milled edge. The new coins were not hand-hammered. They were machine-struck. They were perfectly round. And on the rim, the edge of the coin, they had tiny ridges. or sometimes a Latin inscription, Decus et tutamen, an ornament and a safeguard. If you clipped a milled coin, the damage was instantly visible. The ridges would be gone. Newton had used geometry to defeat the clippers, but there was a bigger threat than the clippers. There were the counterfeiters. And one man in particular became Newton's nemesis, a Moriarty to his Holmes. His name was William Chaloner. Chaloner was a genius in his own right, a rogue, a con man, a master fabricator. He had made a fortune selling fake dildos, acting as a quack doctor, and spying for both sides in political intrigues. But his true art was money. He boasted that he could strike a coin better than the mint itself, and he was right. He set up a secret factory in the countryside. He developed a way to fake the milled edge. He flooded London with false guineas and shillings. When Newton started hunting him, Chaloner didn't run. He counterattacked. He went to Parliament and accused Newton of being incompetent. He claimed the mint was corrupt and that he, Chaloner, should be put in charge of it. It was an insult Newton could not abide. The physicist became a detective. Newton built a network of spies. He went undercover to the seedy taverns and gin shops of London, the hells of the Seven Dials. He interviewed pickpockets and thieves in the dungeons of Newgate Prison. He paid bribes. He turned accomplices. He built a dossier on Chaloner that was inch perfect. It took 2 years, but in the end, Newton won. Chaloner was dragged to Tyburn Tree in 1699. He was hanged, drawn, and quartered. Newton did not attend the execution. He was back at the tower calculating. And this is where the story pivots. Because while Newton was busy catching criminals, he made a mistake, a mathematical error that would change the world more than any hanging. It was 1717. The recoinage was over. The silver was safe. But there was still a problem. England used 2 metals for money, silver and gold. The silver shilling was for daily life, bread, beer, wages. The gold guinea was for big business, land, horses, international trade. The government asked Newton, what is the correct ratio between them? How many shillings is a guinea worth? Newton sat down with his charts. He looked at the price of gold in Paris, in Amsterdam, in Madrid. He wrote a report, a dry technical document titled Representation to the Right Honourable the Lords Commissioners of His Majesty's Revenue. In it, he set the value of the guinea at 21 silver shillings. It seemed like a precise calculation, but it was slightly off. Newton had set the price of gold just a tiny bit too high, maybe by a few pence. But in the world of finance, a few pence is an ocean. Because gold was overpriced in England, merchants from all over the world brought their gold to London. They could get more silver for it there than anywhere else. And conversely, because silver was underpriced, they took English silver and shipped it out. They melted it down and sold it in China or India, where silver was more valuable. Gresham's law kicked in. Bad money drives out good, or in this case, overvalued money drives out undervalued money. Slowly, silently, the silver disappeared. The shillings vanished from pockets. The mint stopped striking them because no one brought silver to the tower. England was supposed to be a bimetallic country, using both silver and gold. But by accident, Newton had drained the silver swamp. Without passing a law, without a grand debate, England drifted onto the gold standard. It became a nation of gold. At first, this was annoying for the poor, who had no small change. But for the bankers, For the merchants of the City of London, it was a revelation. Gold is different from silver. It is denser. It is more valuable per ounce. It is the metal of high trust, long-distance commerce. And as the British Empire began to grow, as the ships of the East India Company sailed to Bombay, as the colonies in America began to expand, the stability of the gold standard became a superpower. In 1816, after the Napoleonic Wars, Britain made it official. The gold sovereign was born, a small, perfect disc of 22-carat gold. On one side, the head of the monarch. On the other, St. George slaying the dragon. This coin became the sun around which the world economy orbited. For the entire 19th century, the Victorian era, the world ran on the Newton standard. It was a time of unprecedented stability. If you were a merchant in London, you knew exactly what a French franc or a German mark was worth. They were all just different weights of gold. Currencies were not floating numbers that changed every second on a screen. They were fixed physical realities. A $5 note was not money. It was a warehouse receipt. It was a claim check that entitled you to walk into the Bank of England and demand 5 gold sovereigns, and the bank had to give them to you. This system, known as the classical gold standard, created the first age of globalization. Capital flowed freely. You could invest in a railway in Argentina or a mine in South Africa with zero currency risk. The world was one single market, united by metal. But there was a cost. The gold standard was a golden fetter. It handcuffed governments. If your economy was crashing, you couldn't just print more money to help people. You couldn't lower interest rates to stimulate business. You were tied to the rock of gold. If you printed more paper than you had gold, people would panic. They would run to the bank to cash in their notes. The bank would run out of gold. The system would collapse. So, governments had to choose austerity. If times were hard, they had to let wages fall. They had to let businesses fail. They had to let the people suffer to protect the pile of metal in the vault. This tension between the stability of gold and the sufferings of the people came to a head not in London, but in America. It is 1896, the Gilded Age. The United States is a divided nation. In the East, in New York and Boston, the bankers love the gold standard. It protects their wealth. It keeps inflation low. It ensures that the money they lend out is paid back in money that is worth just as much. But in the West and the South, on the prairies of Nebraska and the cotton fields of Georgia, the farmers are dying. Prices are falling. Deflation. A farmer takes out a loan to buy a tractor. He expects to pay it back with 1,000 bushels of wheat. But because gold is scarce, the price of wheat drops. Suddenly, he has to grow 2,000 bushels to pay back the same loan. The gold standard was strangling the debtor to feed the creditor. The farmers wanted silver. They wanted free silver. They wanted the government to open the mints and strike millions of silver dollars, to flood the economy with cash, to raise prices, to ease the debt. It was a populist revolt, the pitchforks against the top hats, and they found their voice in a 36-year-old congressman named William Jennings Bryan, July 9th, 1896. The Democratic National Convention in Chicago. The Coliseum is packed, 20,000 men sweating in the summer heat, cigar smoke hanging in the rafters. Bryan steps to the podium. He is young, handsome, with a voice that can reach the back row without a microphone. He delivers one of the most famous speeches in American history. He speaks for the struggling masses. He speaks for the hardy pioneers. He attacks the cities. Burn down your cities and leave our farms, and your cities will spring up again as if by magic, he thunders. But destroy our farms, and the grass will grow in the streets of every city in the country. The crowd is mesmerized. He is building to his climax. He talks about the gold standard. He calls it a weapon of the rich. He raises his hands to his temples, fingers spread like claws. You shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. He drags his fingers down his face as if blood is running. Then he throws his arms out wide, his body forming the shape of a cross. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold. The silence lasts for a heartbeat. Then the Colosseum explodes. Men throw their hats in the air. They weep. They carry Brian around the hall on their shoulders. It was the high watermark of the resistance against gold. But Brian lost. He lost the election to William McKinley. The bankers won. The gold standard survived. The world entered the 20th century locked in the golden embrace. It seemed like the system would last forever. It was rational. It was solid. It was Newtonian. But Isaac Newton knew better than anyone that for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. The pressure was building. The nations of Europe were arming themselves. They were building dreadnoughts and howitzers. And war. War is expensive. Gold is a disciplinarian. It tells you, you can only afford a small war. You can only afford a short war. But the kings and kaisers didn't want a small war. They wanted total war. And to get it, they would have to break the lock. They would have to melt the keys. The 20th century was coming, and it was bringing a fire that would consume the gold standard, the empires that built it, and the very idea that money had to be a thing at all. We are approaching the great decoupling, the moment when money cut the cord and floated free into the stratosphere of pure faith. But before we get to the trenches of the Somme, we have one more stop. A stop in a quiet room where men in suits decided the fate of the world's wallet. The 20th century did not arrive with a whimper, it arrived with the roar of a cannon. And when the guns of August 1914 began to fire, the first casualty was not a soldier. It was the gold standard. For 100 years, the world had lived by the rule of Isaac Newton. Every pound, every franc, every mark was just a name for a specific weight of gold. It was a golden chain that bound the nations together in a tight, disciplined embrace. But war demands looseness. War demands money that can be printed, stretched, and spent without limit. So, in the summer of 1914, the great powers of Europe suspended the convertibility of their currencies. They locked the gold in the vaults. They switched on the printing presses. They thought it would be temporary. They thought the war would be over by Christmas. They were wrong. The war dragged on for 4 years. The printing presses ran hot. And when the smoke cleared in 1918, the world of stable money was gone. In its place was a new and terrifying phenomenon. Let's go to Germany in 1923. The war is lost. The Kaiser has fled. The new Weimar Republic is saddled with crushing debts and reparations payments that it cannot pay. So, they print. At first, the inflation is annoying. Prices go up a little every week, then every day. Then, the dam breaks. Hyperinflation is not just an economic event. It is a psychological trauma. It is the moment when the shared hallucination of money dissolves. Imagine you are sitting in a cafe in Berlin. You order a cup of coffee. The price on the menu is 5,000 marks. You drink the coffee. It takes you perhaps 20 minutes. When you ask for the bill, the waiter apologizes. The price is now 8,000 marks. The value of the money in your pocket has evaporated while you were sipping your drink. Workers were paid twice a day. At lunchtime, they would rush to the factory gates where their wives were waiting. They would throw bundles of cash, millions, billions of marks, over the fence. The wives would run to the shops to buy bread before the prices changed at 1 p.m. People stopped counting money. They started weighing it. There are photographs from this time that look like surrealist art. Children building pyramids out of stacks of banknotes. A woman burning bundles of money in her stove because it was cheaper than buying wood. A man wallpapering his living room with bills because they cost less than actual wallpaper. It was a lesson the world would never forget. When money is not anchored to something real, it can become less than paper. It can become trash. The world was desperate to get back to normal, to get back to gold. In 1925, Winston Churchill, then the Chancellor of the Exchequer in Britain, made a fateful decision. He put Britain back on the gold standard. He wanted to restore the glory of the Victorian age. He wanted the pound to look the dollar in the eye. But you cannot rewind history. The war had changed everything. Britain was poorer. The price of gold had changed. By locking the pound to gold at the old, pre-war price, Churchill accidentally strangled the British economy. It was too expensive. Exports collapsed. Coal miners' wages were cut. The country erupted into the general strike of 1926. It was a disaster. It proved that the old golden fetters were too tight for the modern world. Then came the Great Depression, the final blow. One by one, nations abandoned gold. They had to. They needed to print money to save their dying economies. By the middle of the 1930s, the international monetary system was a smoking ruin. Every country was an island, fighting a trade war with every other country. Then came the Second World War, even more destructive, even more expensive. But as the war began to turn in 1944, the Allies knew they had to plan for the peace. They couldn't go back to the chaos of the 1930s. They couldn't go back to the rigid austerity of the 19th century. They needed a new system, a third way. They decided to meet in a grand hotel in the White Mountains of New Hampshire, the Mount Washington Hotel, Bretton Woods. It is July 1944. 730 delegates from 44 nations gather in this remote luxury resort. The war is still raging in Normandy and the Pacific. But here, surrounded by pine forests and silence, the battle is about money. There are two giants in the room, two men who will fight for the soul of the future. In one corner, representing the fading British Empire, is John Maynard Keynes. He is the most famous economist in history. Brilliant, arrogant, tall, but frail. He is dying of heart disease. He has to rest for hours every day. Keynes has a radical idea. He wants to banish gold. He wants to create a new artificial world currency. He calls it the Bancor. The Bancor would not be owned by any one country. It would be managed by a global central bank. It would be a neutral unit of account designed to keep trade balanced. In the other corner, representing the rising American superpower, is Harry Dexter White. White is a bureaucrat, a treasury official, tough, aggressive, and unbeknownst to everyone in the room, a Soviet spy. White doesn't want a neutral global currency. He wants an American system. He knows that the United States has all the gold. The US holds 2/3 of the world's gold reserves in Fort Knox. The The US is the only major economy left standing. White wants the dollar to be king. The battle between Keynes and White was polite, but brutal. Keynes used his wit and his eloquence. White used his power. In the meetings, White controlled the agenda. He controlled the committees. He wore the British down. In the end, the golden rule applied. He who has the gold makes the rules. Keynes lost. The Bancor died on the drawing board. The system that emerged from Bretton Woods was the White Plan. Here was the deal. The US dollar would be the anchor of the world. Every other currency, the pound, the franc, the lira, would be fixed to the dollar, and the dollar would be fixed to gold, $35 an ounce. That was the magic number. It was a gold exchange standard. You couldn't walk into a bank in New York and trade your dollar bills for gold coins anymore. That was illegal for citizens. But governments could. If France had too many dollars, they could knock on the door of the US Treasury and demand gold bars. It seemed like the perfect compromise. It gave the world the stability of gold, but the flexibility of dollars. And for 25 years, it worked. This was the golden age of capitalism, the 1950s and 60s, the post-war boom, the German miracle, the Japanese miracle. The dollar was as good as gold. Better, actually. It earned interest. But there was a flaw in the design. A time bomb ticking in the foundation. It was called the Triffin Dilemma. To run the global economy, the world needed dollars. To get dollars to the world, the United States had to run a trade deficit. It had to buy things from other countries and send dollars out. But the more dollars the US sent out, the more claim checks there were on the gold in Fort Knox. The pile of gold was finite. The pile of dollars was growing. Eventually, the math wouldn't work. By the late 1960s, the pressure was rising. The United States was spending heavily. The Great Society programs, the space race, and most importantly, the Vietnam War. Inflation started to creep up. The dollar started to look weak. The Europeans noticed. French President Charles de Gaulle was the loudest critic. He hated the exorbitant privilege of the dollar. He saw that America was paying for its war with paper checks that it could never cash. So, he called the bluff. France began to send its dollars back to America. Ships loaded with paper arrived in New York, and ships loaded with gold bars sailed back to France. Other countries followed. The gold began to bleed out of Fort Knox. The US gold reserves fell from over 20,000 tons to under 10,000 tons. The run on the bank had begun. President Richard Nixon was trapped. He faced a choice. He could defend the gold standard, but to do that, he would have to crush the US economy. He would have to raise interest rates, slash spending, and cause a recession. Nixon wanted to get re-elected in 1972. He was not going to cause a recession. So, he chose the nuclear option. Friday, August 13th, 1971. Nixon sneaks out of the White House. He travels to Camp David, the presidential retreat in the Maryland mountains. He takes his top economic advisors with him, Treasury Secretary John Connally, Federal Reserve Chairman Arthur Burns, Paul Volcker. They isolate themselves. They cut the phone lines. This is a secret coup. The atmosphere is tense. There is arguing. Arthur Burns, an old-school economist, begs Nixon not to do it. He says closing the gold window will destroy America's reputation. It is a promise broken. But John Connally, the tough Texan politician, argues for action. He famously tells the Europeans, "The dollar is our currency, but it's your problem." Nixon listens to Connally. They work through the weekend, drafting the speech. On Sunday night, August 15, 1971, Nixon interrupts the popular TV show Bonanza. He speaks to the nation from the Oval Office. He talks about speculators attacking the dollar. He talks about protecting the American worker. And then he drops the hammer. "I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets." Temporarily. That was the lie that changed the world. It wasn't temporary. It was forever. In that instant, the link between money and the physical world was severed. For the first time in 5,000 years of human history, from the barley of Sumer to the shells of the Maldives to the coins of Rome, money was no longer a thing. It was now pure fiat, let it be done. It was a floating abstraction, backed by nothing but the military and economic power of the United States government. The reaction was chaos. The stock market actually boomed the next day, the Nixon rally. But the international currency markets went wild. Currencies began to float. They bobbed up and down against each other like corks in a storm. Traders had to invent new ways to hedge the risk. The modern foreign exchange market, the biggest market in the world, where trillions of dollars change hands every day, was born in the wake of the Nixon shock. We had entered the age of funny money, the age of credit cards, derivatives, and infinite leverage. The barrier was down. There was no longer any physical limit on how much money could be created. And just a few decades later, a group of computer scientists would look at this system of infinite printing and trust in politicians, and they would decide to build something completely different. They would try to build digital gold. But before we get to the blockchain, we have to look at how the consumer experienced this new world, how money disappeared from our pockets and moved into a piece of plastic. The story of the credit card. Money has always had a weight. For thousands of years, to pay for something meant to feel the loss of it. You had to count the gold coins. You had to hand over the sheaf of paper bills. You had to physically separate yourself from your wealth. Psychologists call this the pain of paying. It is a visceral biological reaction. When you hand over cash, the insula, the part of your brain that processes pain, lights up. It hurts, and that pain is a signal. It tells you, stop, be careful, this is finite. But what if you could turn that pain off? What if you could make spending money feel like nothing at all? The revolution didn't start in a bank. It started in a restaurant. It is 1949, New York City, the Major's Cabin Grill, a steakhouse near the Empire State Building. A businessman named Frank McNamara is finishing his dinner. He is entertaining clients. The wine has been poured, the cigars smoked. The bill arrives. McNamara reaches for his wallet, and his heart stops. The pocket is empty. He has left his wallet in another suit. It is the ultimate embarrassment. The waiter is watching. The clients are watching. In 1949, you don't just Venmo someone. If you can't pay, you are washing dishes. Or you are calling your wife. McNamara had to call his wife. She drove into the city to bail him out. But as he sat there, red-faced, waiting for her, he had an idea. He thought, why should I be limited by the cash in my pocket? Why can't my name be enough? A year later, he returned to the same restaurant. But this time, when the bill came, he didn't pull out cash. He pulled out a small cardboard card. On the front, it said, The Diners Club. He signed the back of the bill. The waiter took it. There was no exchange of money, just a signature, a promise. This was the first supper. And with that piece of cardboard, Frank McNamara invented the modern credit card. At first, it was a club for the elite. Salesmen, executives, people who traveled. It wasn't about credit. It was about convenience. You paid the full bill at the end of the month. But the idea was too powerful to stay small. It evolved. The cardboard turned into plastic. The system turned into a machine. If you are old enough, you remember the sound. Click, clack. The sound of the knuckle buster, the manual imprinter. It was a heavy, clunky device sitting on the counter. The merchant would take your card, which had raised embossed numbers, and place it in the tray. They would lay a carbon paper packet over it. Then, they would grab the handle and slide it across. Click, clack. It was a physical act. It required force. It left a perfect copy of your numbers on the paper. The top sheet was yours. The bottom sheet was the bank's. It was slow. It was mechanical. But it was the bridge between the physical money of the past and the digital money of the future. But there was a problem. As credit cards became popular, the lines at the checkout counters got longer. The cashier had to look at your card, then look at a printed book, a hot list of stolen numbers. If your number was in the book, they cut your card in half. If it wasn't, they used the machine. It took too long. The system was choking on paper. We needed a way to make the card talk to the computer. We needed the card to carry its own data. We needed the stripe. This invention came from another accident, this time in a suburban kitchen. It is the 1960s. An engineer at IBM named Forrest Parry is frustrated. He is trying to stick a piece of magnetic tape, the kind used in reel-to-reel audio recorders, onto a plastic identity card for the CIA, but nothing works. The glue warps the tape. The tape peels off. It is a mess. He goes home, carrying his failed prototypes. He walks into the kitchen. His wife, Dorothea, is ironing clothes. She sees him struggling. She looks at the plastic card. She looks at the magnetic tape. She looks at her hot iron. "Why don't you try melting it on?" she asks. "It sounds dangerous. The plastic might melt. The tape might burn." But Forrest tries it. He puts the tape on the card, covers it with a cloth, and runs the hot iron over it. He peels back the cloth. The tape is fused perfectly to the plastic. Smooth, flat, permanent. That was the birth of the magnetic stripe. That black line on the back of your card, that is a recording. It is a piece of music, but the song is your bank account number. Suddenly, the card could be swiped. Beep. The transaction speed went from minutes to seconds. And with that speed, the psychology of money changed forever. When you use cash, you see the money go. You feel the loss, but when you swipe a card, you get the card back. You buy the shoes, you buy the dinner, you buy the plane ticket. And at the end of the transaction, you are still holding your plastic. You haven't lost anything physical. The pain of paying is anesthetized. It creates a decoupling. The joy of buying is separated from the pain of paying. The joy happens now. The pain happens 30 days later, when the bill arrives. And because the pain is delayed, we spend more. Studies show that people are willing to pay up to 100% more for tickets or luxuries when using a credit card compared to cash. The plastic card turned us into a consumer society. It allowed the middle class to live like kings, on borrowed time. But who would issue these cards? At first, it was a chaotic mess. Every bank wanted its own card. In 1958, Bank of America decided to brute force the market. They pulled a stunt that would be illegal today. It was called the Fresno Drop. They chose the city of Fresno, California, a quiet, average American town. On a single day in September, they mailed out 60,000 active credit cards to the residents of Fresno. People opened their mailboxes and found a piece of plastic with their name on it. They hadn't asked for it. They didn't sign up for it. It was just there. $500 of free credit. It was chaos. People went on spending sprees. Fraud was rampant. Thieves stole the cards out of mailboxes. Bank of America lost millions. But it worked. Suddenly, every merchant in Fresno had to accept the card because every customer had one. And every customer used the card because every merchant accepted it. The network effect was born. This Fresno experiment grew into the Bank Americard, which eventually changed its name to something more universal: Visa. Meanwhile, a group of rival banks formed a competitor, the Interbank Card Association. They called their card MasterCharge. Later, simply MasterCard. These two giants, Visa and MasterCard, built the rails that the world economy runs on. They are not banks. They don't lend money. They are the pipes. They are the language that allows a bank in Tokyo to talk to a coffee shop in Seattle in milliseconds. By the 1980s and 90s, money had become almost completely invisible. It was no longer gold. It was no longer paper. It was data. It was a stream of ones and zeros flying through fiber optic cables under the ocean. But there was a dark side to this invisibility. When money becomes data, it becomes trackable. Every swipe of your card leaves a footprint. The bank knows where you ate, what you bought, where you traveled, and it becomes censorable. If the bank doesn't like what you are buying, they can turn off the tap. And, most dangerously, it becomes printable. We saw what happened when Nixon closed the gold window. The discipline was gone. But with the digital revolution, the speed of money creation accelerated to the speed of light. Central banks could create trillions of dollars not by printing press, but by typing a number into a computer. This realization that our money was just a database entry controlled by a few powerful institutions began to worry a certain group of people. They were not bankers. They were not politicians. They were mathematicians, cryptographers, rebels. They called themselves cypherpunks. They met on mailing lists in the dark corners of the early internet. They dreamed of a new kind of money that was digital, like Visa, but private, like cash. Money that was scarce, like gold, but teleporting, like email. Money that no king, no president, and no bank could control. For decades they failed. They tried to build it, and they failed. DigiCash, BitGold, B-Money. They all had a fatal flaw. They all needed a central administrator to keep the ledger. And if you have a central administrator, the government can shut you down. It seemed impossible until 2008, the year the banking system broke, the year the mortgage crisis, fueled by all that cheap credit, all those plastic cards, all those invisible dollars, brought the world to its knees. In the middle of that panic, on a quiet mailing list, a ghost appeared. A person, or a group of people, using the name Satoshi Nakamoto. He posted a link to a white paper. It was only 9 pages long. The title was dry: Bitcoin, a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. But the idea inside was dynamite. Satoshi had solved the unsolvable problem. He had found a way to make digital money without a bank. He had found a way to create trust without a center. He called it the blockchain. And that is where we go next. To the digital mines, to the cryptographic puzzles, to the Genesis block. We are entering the age of the algorithm. The year 2008 felt like a funeral. It wasn't just the stock market crashing. It was the feeling in the air. If you walked through the financial district of New York in September of that year, you saw it. Men in expensive suits walking out of the glass doors of Lehman Brothers, carrying cardboard boxes. Inside the boxes were photos of their children, staplers, awards, the debris of a career. They looked dazed. These were the masters of the universe. They had believed that the system was invincible. They had believed that the math was perfect. But the math had lied. The banks had gambled everything on subprime mortgages, on the idea that housing prices would never fall. They had sliced and diced these bad loans into complex products that no one understood. And when the bubble burst, the entire global financial system froze. Credit dried up. Ships stopped sailing because no one would insure the cargo. ATMs were at risk of running dry. The governments of the world had to step in. They printed trillions of dollars. They bailed out the banks. They rewarded the very people who had caused the disaster. It was a necessary evil, they said, to save the world from a Great Depression. But to a certain group of people watching from the shadows of the internet, it wasn't a rescue. It was a crime scene. These people called themselves the cypherpunks. They were a loose collective of mathematicians, cryptographers, and privacy activists. They met on mailing lists. They wrote code. For decades, they had been obsessed with one problem: how to build money that doesn't rely on the state. They saw what happened when Nixon closed the gold window. They saw what happened in Weimar Germany. They saw what was happening now, in 2008. They believed that as long as money was controlled by politicians and bankers, it would always be corrupted. It would always be inflated. It would always be surveilled. They wanted digital cash. They had tried before. In the 1990s, Adam Back, a British cryptographer, invented Hashcash. It was a system to stop email spam. To send an email, your computer had to solve a little math puzzle. It cost you a fraction of a penny in computing power. It was a brilliant idea. It proved that you could use energy to create scarcity in the digital world. Then there was Nick Szabo, a legal scholar and computer scientist. He proposed BitGold. He imagined a system where computers would solve difficult puzzles to mine digital gold. But these systems all had a fatal flaw: the double spend problem. In the physical world, if I give you a gold coin, I don't have it anymore. I can't spend it again. But in the digital world, a file is just data. If I send you a digital coin, I can just copy and paste the file and send it to someone else. To stop this, you needed a central ledger. You needed a bank to say, Alice spent this coin, it is gone. But if you have a bank, you have a central point of failure. You have a throat to choke. The cypherpunks were stuck. They couldn't solve the riddle until Halloween 2008, October 31st. While the world was still reeling from the crash, an email landed on the cryptography mailing list. The sender was a ghost, a name no one recognized: Satoshi Nakamoto. The subject line was boring, modest: Bitcoin P2P eCash paper. Inside was a link to a 9-page PDF. It was an academic paper, dry, technical, but the abstract contained a sentence that would change history. A purely peer-to-peer version of electronic cash would allow online payments to be sent directly from one party to another without going through a financial institution. Satoshi had solved the double spend problem. He didn't use a bank. He used a blockchain. Here is the genius of it. Instead of one bank keeping the ledger, everyone keeps the ledger. Imagine a Google Doc that everyone in the world can see, but no one can delete. When you want to spend a Bitcoin, you shout it out to the network. I am sending 1 coin to Bob. Thousands of computers, called nodes, hear you. They check their copy of the ledger. Does she have the coin? Yes. Then they bundle your transaction with hundreds of others into a block. But they can't just add the block to the chain. That would be too easy. Spammers would flood the system. They have to earn the right to write the page. They have to solve a puzzle. A cryptographic puzzle that is incredibly hard to solve, but easy to verify. This is mining. Imagine a lottery. Millions of computers are frantically guessing numbers, trying to find the winning ticket. Their fans are whirring. They are burning electricity. They are doing proof of work. When one computer finds the solution, it shouts, "Found it." The other computers check the math. Yes, that's correct. They accept the new block. They chain it to the previous block using a digital fingerprint, a hash, and the winner, the miner who found the block. They get a reward, newly minted bitcoins. This was the alchemy. Satoshi turned electricity into gold. On January 3rd, 2009, Satoshi Nakamoto fired up the software for the first time. He mined block 0, the Genesis block. Buried deep in the code of that first block, hidden in a parameter called the coin base, Satoshi left a message. It wasn't code. It was a headline. He had picked up a copy of the Times newspaper that morning in London. The message read, "The Times, 03 Jan 2009 Chancellor on brink of second bailout for banks." It was a timestamp, proving that the block was created on that day, but it was also a manifesto. It was a finger pointed directly at the old system. The banks are failing. The Chancellor is printing money to save them. We are building the lifeboat. For the first few days, Satoshi was alone on the network, mining blocks, talking to himself. Then, a man named Hal Finney joined. Hal was a legendary cypherpunk. He had actually worked on the original PGP encryption. He lived in California. He downloaded the software. He started running it. His computer fans spun up. On January 12, 2009, Satoshi sent 10 bitcoins to Hal. It was the first transaction. The first time this new money moved from one person to another. Hal later wrote about that moment. He said he felt a sense of awe. He was holding a piece of a new digital reality. But for a long time, Bitcoin was just a toy. It had no price. You couldn't buy anything with it. It was magic internet money played with by geeks. To become money, it had to cross the bridge into the physical world. It needed a price tag. That moment happened on May 27, 2010. A programmer named Laszlo Hanyecz was hungry. He went onto a Bitcoin forum. He posted a message. "I'll pay 10,000 Bitcoins for a couple of pizzas, like maybe 2 large ones so I have some left over for the next day." He specified that he wanted standard stuff, no weird fish topping. 10,000 Bitcoins. At the time, they were worth nothing. 0. A student in England named Jeremy Sturdivant saw the post. He thought, why not? He called a Papa John's in Florida, near where Laszlo lived. He ordered 2 large pizzas. He paid for them with his credit card, about $25. Laszlo sent him the 10,000 Bitcoins. When the doorbell rang at Laszlo's house, and the delivery guy handed him the warm cardboard boxes, history was made. It was the first time Bitcoin had bought a real object. That transaction set a price. 10,000 BTC in about $25, or roughly 0.025 per coin. Today, those two pizzas would be worth hundreds of millions of dollars. It is the most expensive meal in human history. But Laszlo didn't care. He had proved a point. The genie was out of the bottle. Bitcoin began to grow. It grew in the shadows first. On the Silk Road, the black market of the internet, where people used it to buy drugs and fake passports. The media called it drug money. They called it a Ponzi scheme. But the code didn't care. Every 10 minutes, a new block was found. Every 10 minutes, the heartbeat of the network pulsed. Thump, thump. It survived crashes. It survived bans by governments. It survived the disappearance of Satoshi himself, who vanished in 2011, leaving the project in the hands of the community. Bitcoin proved something profound. It proved that trust could be automated. We didn't need the king's face on the coin anymore. We didn't need the signature on the bill of exchange. We didn't need the marble pillars of the bank. We just needed math. Code is law, but as Bitcoin grew, it started to mutate. It inspired thousands of copycats, Ethereum, Ripple, Dogecoin, and it caught the attention of the very people it was designed to replace. The central bankers. They looked at this distributed ledger technology and they thought, wait a minute, we can use this. But we don't want it to be decentralized. We want to control it. And so, we enter the final chapter of our story, the present day and the near future. The empire is striking back. We are moving from the wild, anarchic freedom of the Genesis block to the surveillance state of the CBDC, the central bank digital currency. The battle for the future of money is no longer about gold versus silver. It is about freedom versus control. And it is happening right now, in the servers of the Federal Reserve and the People's Bank of China. We are now in the final act of the story of money. And this act is not about gold. It is not about paper. It is not even about math. It is about vision. For 5,000 years, money was something you held. It was private. When a Roman soldier bought a cup of wine with a silver denarius, no one else knew. When a cowboy bought a drink in a saloon with a gold coin, it was a transaction between two people. Even when we moved to paper, money kept its secrets. If you had a $20 bill in your pocket, that bill didn't know your name. It didn't know where you lived. It just worked. But that privacy is dying. We are building a new kind of bank, a bank made of glass, where every wall is transparent, where every transaction is visible, and where the banker sits in a tower in the center, watching everything. This idea didn't start in a high-tech lab in Silicon Valley. It started in the dusty, unpaved streets of Kenya. The year is 2007. Kenya is a country where banks are scarce. If you live in a village, the nearest bank branch might be a day's walk away. People kept their savings under mattresses. They sent money to relatives by handing an envelope of cash to a bus driver and hoping he wouldn't steal it. Then, a mobile phone company called Safaricom noticed something strange. People were using their mobile airtime as currency. They would buy prepaid minutes. Then, instead of making a call, they would transfer the minutes to a cousin in the city. The cousin would then sell the minutes to a shopkeeper for cash. The airtime was money. Safaricom decided to formalize this. They launched a service called M-Pesa, 3M for mobile, Pesa for money in Swahili. It was simple. You didn't need a smartphone. You didn't need an app. You just needed an old Nokia brick phone. You sent a text message. Click, send, and suddenly money teleported across the country. It was a miracle for the poor. It reduced crime. It allowed businesses to bloom, but it also did something else. It turned every phone into a tracking device. Safaricom could see exactly who was paying whom. They could see the flow of the entire economy in real time. This success caught the eye of governments around the world. They looked at M-Pesa and thought, if a phone company can do this, why can't we? And if we do it, we can see everything. Let's travel to India, November 8th, 2016. It is 8 p.m. Prime Minister Narendra Modi appears on television. He makes a shocking announcement. Effective immediately, at midnight tonight, the two largest banknotes in India, the 500 and 1,000 rupee notes, are worthless. Demonetization. 86% of the cash in circulation is cancelled in a single stroke. The stated goal is to fight black money, corruption, tax evasion, terrorism. But the result is chaos. The next morning, the banks are besieged. Lines snake around city blocks. People are desperate. They are clutching bags of old cash, trying to exchange it before it becomes paper waste. People die in the queues. Weddings are cancelled. Small businesses that rely on cash shut down. But in the aftermath, something happened. Digital payments exploded. Paytm, Google Pay, PhonePe. The Indian economy was forced violently onto the digital grid. The government introduced UPI, the Unified Payments Interface, a seamless, instant, digital system connected to your biometric ID. It is efficient, it is modern, it is a marvel, but it is also the end of privacy. Now, the government knows exactly how much rice you buy. They know which doctor you visit. They know which political party you donate to. And this brings us to the final frontier, the ultimate weapon of the new monetary order, the CBDC, Central Bank Digital Currency. This is not like the money in your bank account today. When you use a debit card, you are using commercial bank money. The bank is a private company. It stands between you and the Federal Reserve. But with a CBDC, you cut out the middleman. You have an account directly with the central bank. The money in your digital wallet is a direct liability of the state. Why does this matter? Because digital money is programmable. Listen to Agustin Carstens, the head of the Bank for International Settlements, the central bank for central banks. In 2020, he said this: "We don't know who's using our $100 bill today, and we don't know who's using a 1,000 peso bill today." The key difference with the CBDC is the central bank will have absolute control on the rules and regulations that will determine the use of that expression of central bank liability. And also, we will have the technology to enforce that. Absolute control. What does absolute control look like? Let's go to China. The People's Bank of China is already testing the digital yuan, ECNY. In Shenzhen, they ran a lottery. They gave away millions of digital yuan to citizens. But this money came with a catch. It had an expiration date. Use it by next Tuesday, or it vanishes. Imagine that. Money that rots like fruit. If the economy is slow, the government could push a button and say, everyone must spend 10% of their savings this month or lose it. Or imagine negative interest rates. If you save too much, the government could tax your savings automatically, in real time, to force you to spend. Or imagine social credit. You jaywalked? Your fine is deducted instantly. You bought too much alcohol. Your wallet locks you out of the liquor store. You tried to buy a train ticket to a protest. Transaction declined. This is the panopticon. Jeremy Bentham the 18th century philosopher designed a prison called the panopticon. It was a circle of cells with a watchtower in the middle. The guard could see every prisoner, but the prisoners couldn't see the guard. Because the prisoners never knew if they were being watched, they had to behave as if they were watched all the time. We are building a financial panopticon, and this is the choice we face in the 21st century. On one side, we have the crypto rebels, Bitcoin, DeFi, money that is chaotic, volatile, often used for scams, but is mathematically private and uncensorable. Money that is permissionless. On the other side, we have the central bankers, CBDCs, money that is stable, efficient, clean, but is totally surveilled and controlled. Money that is permissioned. The war between these two visions has already begun. Countries like Nigeria have launched CBDCs and tried to restrict cash withdrawals to force people to use them. People rioted. Countries like El Salvador have made Bitcoin legal tender. The US is hesitant. The Fed is studying the digital dollar. But the technology is ready. And as we stand on this precipice, looking at the death of cash, we have to ask ourselves a question. What is money for? Is it just a tool to move value efficiently? Or is it a fundamental liberty? Is the right to transact privately, to buy a book, to support a cause, to help a friend, as important as the right to speak? Because if money becomes speech, and the government controls the money, then the government controls the speech. The story of money began with a promise between two people to trade value. It became a coin stamped with an emperor's face. It became a paper note signed by a governor. It became a digital signal sent through a wire. And now, it is becoming a line of code. The question is, who writes the code? Do we write it together? Or does the emperor write it for us? In the final chapter, we will look at the horizon. We will look past the current battle to the future of value itself. A future where AI, fusion energy, and abundance might change the definition of wealth entirely. A future where we might not need money at all. The story of money has been a story of scarcity. We used barley because it took time to grow. We used gold because it was hard to find. We used Bitcoin because it cost energy to mine. Money is a tool we use to ration the world. It is the referee that decides who gets the limited supply of shoes, houses, and bread. But what if the referee is no longer needed? What if the scarcity ends? We are standing on the edge of a new era. An era where the rules of economics, which have governed human behavior for 10,000 years, might simply evaporate. Let's look at the first crack in the dam. Energy. In 1921, Henry Ford, the man who put the world on wheels, had an idea that was far ahead of its time. He looked at the banking system, at the wars fought over gold mines, and he was disgusted. He proposed a new kind of currency. He called it the energy currency. He wanted to build a massive dam on the Tennessee River. The dam would generate electricity, and the dollar would be backed not by gold in a vault, but by kilowatt hours in the wire. Units of power. Ford believed that energy was the only real value. Gold can be hoarded. Gold is useless if you are freezing, but energy is life. Energy is work. His idea was killed by Congress. The bankers hated it. But today, we are accidentally building Henry Ford's dream. Bitcoin is, in many ways, an energy currency. To create it, you must burn electricity. The value of the network is tied to the physics of the grid. And as we move toward fusion power, towards a world where energy might become cheap, abundant, and clean, the cost of everything changes. If energy is free, then water is free, because you can desalinate the ocean. If energy is free, then food is cheap, because you can grow it in vertical farms with artificial light. If energy is free, then transportation is nothing. When the cost of making stuff drops to zero, what happens to money? Science fiction has already imagined this world for us. Think of Star Trek. In the 24th century, Captain Picard doesn't carry a wallet. If he wants a cup of tea, he walks to a machine in the wall, a replicator, and says, "Tea, Earl Grey, hot." The machine hums. It rearranges subatomic particles. And there is the tea. It didn't cost anything to make. There is no supply chain. There is no baker, no potter, no tea plantation. In a world of replicators, money becomes obsolete. Why would you steal a diamond if you can print a diamond? Why would you hoard gold if gold is as common as plastic? In this post-scarcity world, the only thing that has value is the one thing that cannot be replicated: the human. Specifically, human creativity, human attention, human time. If you can have any object you want, you stop caring about objects. You start caring about connection. You want the hand-painted painting, not the replicated one. You want the dinner cooked by a friend, not the machine. You want the story. We are already seeing the early signs of this shift. Look at the attention economy. Today, the most valuable companies in the world, Google, Meta, TikTok, don't sell you stuff. They give you the stuff for free. They give you the search engine. They give you the video. They give you the map. In exchange, they take your time. Your attention is the new gold. You are paying for your digital life with the seconds of your day. And look at the rise of time banking. In Japan, there is a system called Furei Kippu, ticket for a caring relationship. It was invented to help care for the elderly. If you go and help an old lady with her shopping, you earn a ticket. You can save that ticket. Years later, when you are sick or your mother is sick, you can spend that ticket to get help. It is a currency, but it is not backed by the government. It is backed by compassion. It is backed by the community. It is a return to the very beginning. Remember the village we started in? The village of the silent ledger. In that village, everyone knew everyone. If you were a good person, you were rich in friends. If you were a bad person, you were poor. Technology is bringing us back to the village, but this time, the village is the size of the planet. On the internet, your reputation follows you everywhere. Your Uber rating, your eBay seller score, your credit score, your likes, your followers. We are building a global ledger of reputation. In the future, rich might not mean having a high number in a bank account. It might mean having a high trust score. It might mean being someone that other people want to be around. The billionaire of the 22nd century might be the person who has contributed the most art, the most knowledge, or the most kindness to the common pool. So, where does that leave us? We have walked a long road. We started with the gift, where value was a feeling between neighbors. We moved to commodities, where value was a cow or a shell. We invented coins and stamped the king's face on trust. We invented paper and trusted the emperor's promise. We invented banks and turned money into math. We invented gold standards and tried to anchor money to the earth. We invented fiat and floated money on faith. We invented plastic and made money invisible. We invented crypto and tried to give money to the robots. And now we are looking at the horizon. The story of money is the story of humanity trying to solve a single problem. How do we cooperate? How do we work together without killing each other? How do we build cities with strangers? Money was the tool we built to solve that problem. It was a brilliant tool. It allowed us to conquer the world. But tools are not forever. We used stone axes once. We used bronze swords. We used steam engines. Eventually, we outgrow them. Maybe, just maybe, in the deep future, we will look back at money the way we look back at the stone axe. We will see it as a crude, heavy, clumsy thing. A thing that caused so much pain. A thing that made us greedy and anxious. But we will also respect it, because it was the ladder we climbed to get out of the mud. And once we are at the top, once we are standing in the light of a world where everyone has enough, we can kick the ladder away, we can close the ledger, we can stop counting, and we can finally, truly, just live. This has been the story of the birth of money. It is a story that is still being written. Every time you tap your card, every time you check your balance, every time you dream of what you would do if you didn't have to worry about the cost. Thank you for walking this long road with me. If you enjoyed this journey through history, from the cowrie shell to the blockchain, please take a moment to click the like button. It helps this channel more than you know. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories that unravel the complex machinery of our world and lay it out in the quiet of the night, then subscribe. There are many more economies to explore, many more histories to dream about. But for now, the markets are closed. The ledger is balanced. Sleep well.